Look, I'm going to be completely honest with you right now. What happened to Lewis Hamilton at Silverstone on July 5th, 2026 was one of the most telling examples of how even the greatest champions in the world can have everything collapse around them in a single afternoon. And today, I'm breaking down every single detail that the stewards didn't want you to fully understand. But before I do that, here's what you need to know. A seven-time world champion came home to his own racetrack, finished on the podium, and still somehow walked away with a penalty, a reprimand, an investigation that shook the entire paddock, and a strategic decision that cost him a guaranteed second-place finish. The question that's been burning through the F1 community is simple. How does this happen? How does a driver of Hamilton's caliber, someone with literally decades of experience, someone who's won more races than almost anyone in history, end up in the steward's office for something that the stewards themselves admitted wasn't entirely his fault? And the answer to that question is way more complicated than anyone's been saying, because it reveals something genuinely important about how modern Formula One actually works when the cameras stop rolling. So stick around, because we're about to dissect the exact moment everything went wrong, examine the steward's reasoning frame by frame, and figure out what this verdict actually means for the rest of the season. Let me take you back to Friday morning at Silverstone, because that's where this whole story actually starts. Lewis Hamilton showed up feeling good. He'd switched to Ferrari, this was his home race, these are the conditions he historically loves, and the car felt alive under him. Friday practice, the day where drivers get genuine laps without the pressure of qualifying or race strategy, that's when drivers find the magic. That's when everything clicks into place. Hamilton found that magic. He was quick, he was confident, he was flowing through the corners in a way that made everyone around him look like they were driving in slow motion. You could see it in the data. You could hear it in his radio messages. He was locked in, he was ready. And then, something happened between Friday evening and Saturday morning that completely changed the narrative. The magic disappeared, just vanished. And this is something that people outside of Formula One don't really appreciate. Sometimes the conditions shift. Sometimes a mechanical adjustment goes wrong. Sometimes your brain just doesn't connect with the car the same way. Hamilton later admitted that all the magic that I had on Friday just disappeared through the weekend. That's not an excuse. That's a genuine technical statement about what was happening with the car. Something, whether it was setup, whether it was weather, whether it was tire degradation patterns, something changed, and he spent the entire rest of the weekend trying to adapt to a car that no longer felt like home. This is crucial context because it's the foundation for everything that happened on Sunday. He was already working with a compromised setup before the race even started. He was already fighting the machine before fighting his competitors. Sunday morning, grid positions locked in, weather still uncertain, and Hamilton's car still not feeling quite right. But here's where things took a dramatic turn in the opening minutes. The start, that moment when the lights go out and everyone presses full throttle for turn one. That's where Hamilton's day essentially ended before it really began. He got away too early, a false start. Not a huge margin, not something that was obviously intentional, but clearly early enough that the FIA stewards noticed, clearly early enough that it triggered their protocols, and immediately he's hit with a 5-second penalty that's going to be served during his first pit stop. Now, in Formula One, a 5-second penalty during a pit stop is actually absorbed pretty cleanly because pit stops take about 2.5 seconds anyway, so you're really only losing 2.5 seconds of track position. But here's the thing about being penalized before you've even completed one lap of racing. It destroys your mentality. You've got no points yet, the race hasn't really begun, and you're already in deficit mode. You're already trying to make something up that shouldn't have been lost in the first place. For a competitive driver, especially one who's used to controlling every element of his performance, that's genuinely infuriating. But Hamilton's a professional, and professionals adapt. He got through the first pit stop, the penalty was served, and he refocused on the race ahead. The problem was that the damage was done. Not just 5 seconds of damage, but psychological damage. He was chasing now instead of leading. And in Formula One, chasing always costs more than leading. Now here's where I want to break down what actually happened during the race itself, because this is where the real story gets interesting. Hamilton fought his way through the field. This is what he does. This is what he spent his entire career doing, putting bad situations behind him and just driving forward. He was getting into a decent rhythm. He was managing his tires. He was making those little strategic calculations that separate good drivers from great drivers. And at various points through the race, he actually climbed into a position where P2, second place, looked genuinely achievable. George Russell was ahead of him, but Russell was vulnerable. The gap was closing, and if Hamilton could time his move move right, he could get himself into a solid points finish. And that's when Mercedes made the call that changed absolutely everything. A safety car came out, yellow flags around the track, incident ahead, and suddenly the entire race dynamics shifted in a moment. Safety cars in modern Formula One create these binary moments where you have to make instantaneous decisions about what strategy. Do you pit? Do you stay out? And Mercedes, looking at the data, looking at the tire situation, looking at the track position, made the decision to bring Hamilton in for new tires while Russell stayed out. In theory, and I want to emphasize, in theory, this was actually a brilliant move. Fresh tires, newer rubber with more grip, more potential for pace in the final stint. It should have been the move that puts Hamilton ahead of Russell, that puts him in position to fight for the win, that turns his bad day into a good result. Except for one small problem. The race ended under safety car conditions. No sprint to the finish, no final stint where new tires could prove their advantage. Russell's older tires held on just fine without being challenged, and Hamilton's brand new rubber never got the temperature cycles it needed to perform. He finished behind Russell, his own teammate, in the same Ferrari, and that's when his day transformed from bad to completely frustrating. But this is actually where I need to talk about something that a lot of casual F1 fans completely miss, and it's the fact that finishing in third place while your teammate finishes in second is actually a bigger psychological blow than the time gap suggests. You're in the same car, you have the same resources, you have the same strategy team, and somehow the other guy finished ahead. It's not about the steward's decisions or bad luck, it's about a strategic choice that you made or that was made on your behalf, and it didn't work out. And when you're fighting for your career relevance in year one at a new team, that kind of result stings way more than the points gap indicates. Hamilton knew immediately what had happened. You could see it in his eyes when he crossed the line. He was angry, not at the stewards, not at Russell, but at himself and his team for making a call that seemed logical in the moment, but turned out to be exactly wrong. This is the kind of result that haunts drivers for weeks. This is what they relive in simulator sessions. This is what they analyze with engineers until 2 a.m. in debriefs. Because if they just left him out there, he could have finished second. He could have gotten the fresher tire advantage. He could have shown that his pace was still there. Instead, he finished third, and the narrative became about a pit stop decision that failed. Now we get to the part that actually shook the sport, because while Hamilton was still processing the pit stop strategy mistake, while he was still coming to terms with losing second place to Russell, the stewards made an announcement that he was being investigated for a yellow flag infringement. A yellow flag. Turn 9, lap 38. This is where it gets genuinely complex, and this is where I need you to really understand what happened, because the steward's reasoning is absolutely fascinating from a sporting perspective. Yellow flags in Formula One exist for one critical reason: safety. When there's an incident on track, when a car that's stopped or damaged, when there's a hazard that drivers might not see, yellow flags go up, and the rule is simple. You see a yellow flag, you reduce speed immediately, you show respect for the hazard, and you prepare yourself for the possibility that there could be something dangerous around the next corner. It's a safety rule, not just some arbitrary regulation. Yellow flags have prevented countless accidents. They've saved lives. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is the part that the steward's official document actually acknowledges in detail. The communication of that yellow flag to Hamilton was genuinely problematic. Hamilton entered the sector, turn 9, the relevant yellow flag area, before any yellow flag or yellow light panel was actually displayed. Let me repeat that because it's crucial. He was already in the yellow flag sector before there was any yellow flag visible. The yellow indication on his steering wheel display only appeared after he was already on the straight heading toward turn 10, which is basically at the end of the yellow flag zone anyway. There was no physical yellow light panel in his immediate field of vision. The warning on his display was visible for only a very short period of time. And this is where I genuinely sympathize with Hamilton's situation, because the stewards basically admitted in their reasoning that the warning was too late and too brief for anyone reasonably to react to it. Think about what a Formula One driver's brain is processing in any given moment at 200 miles per hour. You're managing tire temperatures, knowing exactly how warm your front left is, how that affects braking, how that affects cornering speed. You're managing fuel consumption because if you use too much now, you might not make it to the end of the race. You're checking your mirrors constantly because there's always someone trying to pass you, someone trying to capitalize on any mistake. You're analyzing braking points for every corner, thinking about where you're going to pass the guy ahead, where you're vulnerable to being passed from behind. You're processing radio communications from your engineer. You're thinking about pit stop strategy. You're analyzing how your tires are degrading. You're managing your energy systems. You're thinking about weather conditions.
All of this simultaneously, your brain is running at absolute maximum capacity. And in that exact moment, when Hamilton was doing all of this, he was also battling with Max Verstappen immediately before entering the yellow flag sector. He wasn't just driving casually through that area, he was defending his position, fighting with another driver, and his attention was firmly fixed on his mirrors, watching for a counterattack.
Stewards actually acknowledged this in their report. They said his attention remained directed to his mirrors for most of the straight towards turn 10 rather than immediately towards the green light panel at the end of the sector. In other words, he was doing exactly what a race driver is supposed to do, defending his position, while simultaneously being expected to catch a warning that came from a direction he wasn't looking toward, appeared too late in his visual field, and lasted for an impossibly short time. This is where the stewards' decision gets really interesting, because they actually found that Hamilton did not make a discernible reduction of speed after the yellow flag indication appeared and the green light panel illuminated. So technically, there was a violation. The rule says yellow flag means slow down, and the evidence showed he didn't slow down. That's what justified the reprimand. But their reasoning showed they understood that this wasn't about Hamilton being reckless or ignoring safety procedures. It was about a driver facing an impossible situation with warning timing that made compliance essentially impossible. Here's the official steward statement, and I want to quote this because it matters. Hamilton failed to slow for a single yellow flag at turn 9 on lap 38. But then they included all this context explaining how he entered the sector before any warning was visible, how the yellow indication only appeared once he was already most of the way through, how there was no yellow light panel in his immediate field of vision, how the indication lasted only a very short period, and how he was defending against Verstappen while all this was happening. They were basically laying out in meticulous detail all the reasons why this wasn't as clear-cut as a driver deliberately ignoring safety procedures. But the rule is absolute. Yellow flags mean slow down, period. There's no exception for "but I didn't see it in time" or "but I was focused on defending against another driver." The rules exist for safety, and safety regulations can't have gray areas. That's actually the correct approach from a steward's perspective. But what this verdict reveals is that there's a broader conversation that needs to happen in Formula One about how these alerts are communicated to drivers, about how drivers can practically receive and process them at racing speeds, and about whether the current system actually achieves its safety goals or just creates violations when drivers genuinely can't respond in time. The stewards gave Hamilton a reprimand, not a time penalty, not a grid penalty, just an official warning, his first of the season. It goes on his record, but it's the lightest form of punishment available, which suggests the stewards themselves acknowledged that this was a complicated situation, not a straightforward safety violation. After the verdict came down, something happened that I genuinely appreciated from Hamilton. Instead of making excuses, instead of blaming the stewards or the system or everyone else, he just reflected on the entire day and owned what he could control. When asked about the pit stop decision, he admitted they probably could have predicted that the race would end under safety car, but they made the decision they thought was right in the moment. That's honest. That's a world champion taking responsibility for his team's strategic choices, even when they don't work out. He talked about the false start, about the yellow flag situation, about just having one of those days where everything goes wrong simultaneously. And he gave full credit to his teammate Charles Leclerc for the win, saying Leclerc did a great job. That's classy. That's mature. That's someone who understands that in Formula One, your job is to deliver the best performance possible with the tools you have on that particular day. And sometimes, despite your best efforts, it's just not enough. He also said something really revealing about the car setup. All the magic that I had on Friday just disappeared through the weekend. I was just lacking front end, and we massively under-egged it with the front wing. That's my fault and the engineering fault. He's literally saying the team set up the car too conservatively on the front wing, and he's taking responsibility for not catching it and pushing back earlier. That's the kind of accountability that separates good drivers from great drivers. What I found myself thinking about after analyzing all of this is that Silverstone 2026 might actually go down as one of those symbolic races in Lewis Hamilton's Ferrari era. His first podium with the team, at home, in front of his home crowd, but it came with complications and frustrations and a car setup issue and a strategic gamble that didn't pay off and a rules violation that felt almost inevitable given the circumstances. It wasn't the triumphant homecoming narrative that Ferrari and Hamilton probably wanted to write in their marketing materials, but it was real, it was authentic. It showed that even for the greatest drivers in the world, sometimes the universe just doesn't cooperate. You can't control everything. You can't eliminate bad luck. You can't force a car to perform the way it performed on Friday when something changes. And sometimes a strategic call that makes perfect sense in the moment just turns out to be exactly wrong by the time the checkered flag comes out. This verdict and this investigation actually reveals something important about modern Formula One. It's not just about raw speed anymore. It's about strategy. It's about managing your car's performance across an entire weekend. It's about making split-second decisions with incomplete information. And it's about understanding that sometimes you do everything right and still don't get the result you wanted. The question now is whether Hamilton can take this Silverstone experience, learn from the car setup issues, understand what went wrong with the strategic decision, and come back stronger in the upcoming Grand Prix. Because if there's one thing I've learned watching him over the years, it's that he's genuinely dangerous when he's had a bad race. He doesn't forget about it. He doesn't move on casually. He uses it, he learns from it, he analyzes it, and he usually shows up at the next race with something to prove. Silverstone 2026 might just be the moment that the Ferrari era shifts from promise into something more tangible, because now Hamilton knows exactly what the car is capable of, exactly where the setup went wrong, and exactly what he needs to do differently next time. That's the kind of knowledge that's worth more than any single race result. And if I had to predict, I'd say we're about to see a very different Lewis Hamilton at the next Grand Prix.